Some people think justice requires dramatic confrontations, raised voices, and public scenes. They're wrong. Real justice is patient, methodical, and devastating in its quiet precision. This is the story of how one phone call, made calmly, legally, and without warning, dismantled a man's empire and restored my brother's dignity. How does a capable man end up scrubbing restrooms on his first day at his wife's family company, while her father laughs and calls it his level? How did that moment of humiliation become the catalyst for reputational damage so severe that clients walked away and a marriage collapsed? This is how I handled it. Quietly, strategically, and completely within the bounds of the law. I arrived at Ventor Industrial Solutions 15 minutes early that Tuesday morning, wanting to surprise Marlow on his first day. The lobby gleamed with polished marble and brass fixtures, projecting the kind of success that Kai Ventor loved to display. Corporate awards lined the walls, and a reception desk commanded the center of the space like a throne. "Mr. Trasker is starting his orientation," the receptionist informed me with practiced politeness. "Mr. Ventor is personally conducting the tour." I settled into one of the leather chairs, content to wait and catch Marlow when he emerged. Through the glass partition, I could hear Kai's booming voice echoing down the corridor, the same authoritative tone I'd grown to recognize at family dinners, always lecturing, always positioning himself as the expert on everything. "Now, Marlow, success in this company starts with understanding that every role has dignity," Kai was saying as they passed by the lobby. "We don't have hierarchies here. We have learning opportunities." I watched my younger brother nod respectfully, his shoulders straight, with the kind of hopeful energy he'd carried since landing this position. Marissa had convinced him this was his chance to prove himself, to finally have the career stability that had eluded him at his previous job. Kai had graciously agreed to give him a shot, as he'd put it at the wedding reception. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The tour seemed unusually long for a first day, but I remained patient, checking emails on my phone and observing the steady flow of employees through the lobby. Professional, efficient, exactly what you'd expect from a successful industrial solutions company. It was the smell that first alerted me something was wrong. I followed the scent of industrial cleaner down a side corridor, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. The sound of running water and the scrape of a brush against porcelain grew louder as I approached the employee restroom area. That's where I found him. Marlow knelt beside a toilet, rubber gloves extending past his wrists, methodically scrubbing the bowl with a brush that had seen better days. His dress shirt, the one he'd picked out specially for his first day, was already stained with cleaning solution. A bucket of supplies sat beside him, along with a clipboard that appeared to contain a detailed checklist. "Getting acquainted with the foundation of our operation, I see." Kai's voice boomed from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway with Marissa, both of them wearing expressions that made my stomach tighten. Kai's face showed the satisfied smile of a man delivering what he considered an important lesson. Marissa's expression was more complex, a mixture of embarrassment and defiance, as if she was simultaneously uncomfortable with the scene and determined to support her father's methods. "Every employee needs to understand how this company operates from the ground up," Kai continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining basic facts to a child. "Marlow is learning that no job is beneath him. Character building, you might say." Marlow looked up at that moment and saw me standing there. The humiliation in his eyes was immediate and profound, not just the embarrassment of being caught in a degrading situation, but the deeper shame of having his older brother witness his acceptance of it. He quickly looked away, returning his attention to the toilet bowl, as if the task required his complete focus. "Grant," Marissa said, her voice artificially bright, "we didn't expect you today." "I wanted to wish Marlow luck on his first day," I replied calmly, keeping my tone neutral. "I can see he's getting oriented." Kai chuckled, a sound that contained more condescension than humor. Orientation is exactly right. Too many people want to start at the top without understanding the foundation. Marlow here is learning what real work looks like. I watched my brother's shoulders tense at those words, but he said nothing. He simply continued scrubbing, his movements mechanical and precise. The Marlow I knew, the one who'd managed complex projects at his previous job, who'd earned recognition for his problem-solving skills, seemed to have disappeared entirely. "Well," I said, maintaining the same calm tone, "I don't want to interrupt his learning experience." "Smart man," Kai replied, clapping me on the shoulder with the casual dominance he applied to every interaction. Marlow is lucky to have family who understands the value of hard work. I nodded politely and walked away without another word. No confrontation, no dramatic speeches, no attempts to rescue my brother from his situation. I simply left the building, got in my car, and sat in the parking lot for several minutes, processing what I'd witnessed. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It wasn't hazing or a misguided attempt at team building. It was deliberate, calculated degradation designed to establish dominance and crush independence. Kai Ventor was teaching my brother his place in the hierarchy, and that place was at the very bottom, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity he was allowed to retain. I pulled out my phone and made a call. "Graham Holloway Compliance Consulting," came the professional voice on the other end. "Graham, it's Grant Trasker. I need to discuss a potential consultation regarding workplace compliance and governance standards. When would be a good time to meet?" The call was brief and purely professional. Nothing emotional, nothing traceable. I ended it, started my car, and understood that while Marlow had chosen to accept his situation for now, I had made a quiet, deliberate choice that would prove far more dangerous to Kai Ventor. The cafe on 5th Street had become neutral ground for Marlow and me. I'd suggested lunch 3 days after his first day at Ventor Industrial, and he'd agreed eagerly. When Marlow arrived, he looked emotionally drained, the same hollow expression from our childhood after enduring our father's harsh criticism. I asked how the new job was going. Marlow forced some enthusiasm. He said it was educational, explaining that Kai believed in comprehensive training, learning every part of the operation before advancing. I pressed gently, asking what that meant in practice. Marlow described spending his first days on maintenance and facility work, framed as understanding the foundation before management. He repeated Kai's language almost verbatim. I recognized it immediately. Justification disguised as mentorship. Marlow was already absorbing humiliation and reframing it as growth, turning control into opportunity through sheer determination to endure. "And Marissa? How does she feel about your comprehensive training?" Something flickered across Marlow's face. Doubt, maybe, or frustration. "She understands her father's methods. He built this company from nothing, so his approach obviously works." "Obviously," I agreed, though my tone suggested nothing of the sort. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, but I could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he set down his sandwich and looked at me directly. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "About what you saw the other day." "What am I thinking?" "That it was degrading. That I shouldn't have to clean toilets when I was hired for a project management position." His voice carried a defensive edge, but underneath it was something that sounded like relief. As if he'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge what he couldn't say himself. "Was it degrading?" I asked simply. Marlow looked away, focusing on the traffic outside the window. "It's temporary." Kai explained that everyone starts at the bottom, regardless of their background. Even family. "Especially family?" He didn't answer that question directly, but his silence was answer enough. Over the following weeks, our lunch meetings became a window into Marlow's systematic diminishment. The stories emerged gradually, each one presented as evidence of Kai's wisdom and the company's unique culture, but collectively painting a picture of calculated humiliation. There was the day Marlow was assigned to clean the parking lot while clients arrived for an important meeting. Kai wanted me to observe how he handles high-stakes negotiations, Marlow explained, and he thought I'd learn more by seeing the preparation that goes into making the right first impression. The day he was required to serve coffee during a board meeting, standing silently in the corner while Kai discussed strategies and financial projections. I got to hear executive-level planning, Marlow said. Most employees never get that kind of insight. The day he was sent to pick up Kai's dry cleaning during his lunch break, then criticized for taking too long when he returned. Time management is crucial in this business, Marlow recited. Kai was teaching me about efficiency. Each story was wrapped in the language of opportunity and education, but the pattern was unmistakable. Kai was systematically stripping away Marlow's professional identity, reducing him to a servant whose primary value lay in his willingness to accept whatever treatment was offered. The most telling moment came during a family dinner at Kai and Dahlia's house 3 weeks into Marlow's employment. I'd been invited as a courtesy, the extended family member who needed to be included but could be safely ignored during the important conversations. Marlow is really thriving in his new role, Kai announced over the main course, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man discussing a successful project. He's learning that real success comes from understanding every level of an operation. It's been incredibly educational, Marlow agreed, though his smile looked strained. Some people think they can walk into a family business and immediately deserve respect, Kai continued, cutting his steak with deliberate precision. But respect is earned through service, through proving your value every single day. Marissa nodded approvingly. Daddy's always believed in meritocracy. Everyone has to prove themselves, even family. Especially family, Kai corrected, and I caught the slight flinch that crossed Marlow's face. Family members who don't earn their place become a liability. They damage the company's reputation and create resentment among other employees. Lucky thing Marlow is such a quick learner, I said mildly. Kai's eyes sharpened slightly as he looked at me, perhaps detecting something in my tone that didn't quite match my words. Marlow understands the opportunity he's been given. Not everyone gets a chance to learn from someone with my experience. Not everyone, I agreed. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed how Marlow remained quiet for the rest of the evening, responding when spoken to but offering no independent thoughts or observations. The confident, capable man I'd known was disappearing, replaced by someone who'd learned that silence was safer than self-expression. After dinner, as we walked to our cars, Marlow finally spoke freely. I know it looks bad from the outside, he said quietly. But this is my chance, Grant. My chance to finally have real security, to build something lasting. At what cost? He stopped walking and turned to face me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old Marlow, the one who'd never backed down from a challenge, who'd built his own success through talent and determination. What choice do I have? He asked, and the resignation in his voice was heartbreaking. I left my last job for this opportunity. Marissa believes in her father's methods, and she believes in me. I can't just walk away because the training is more intensive than I expected. Training, I repeated. Is that what you call it? It's what it is, he said firmly, but the conviction sounded hollow. I didn't push further that night. Marlow wasn't ready to hear what I was thinking, and pushing him would only drive him deeper into Kai's web of rationalization and control. But as I drove home, I was already planning my next conversation with Graham Holloway. Some battles require patience, and some Kais require careful preparation. Kai Ventor had spent weeks teaching my brother to accept humiliation as education. Soon he would learn what real education looked like. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, while I was reviewing contracts in my home office. Marlow's voice was different, not just tired or frustrated, but hollow in a way that immediately put me on alert. Can you meet me tonight? he asked without preamble. I need to talk to someone who isn't. He paused, searching for words. Someone who isn't invested in the company's success. We met at a bar across town, the kind of anonymous place where conversations could happen without risk of being overheard by anyone who mattered. Marlow was already there when I arrived, nursing a beer and staring at the condensation on the bottle as if it contained answers to questions he couldn't articulate. What happened? I asked, sliding into the booth across from him. He looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just humiliation or frustration, but a kind of existential exhaustion, as if he'd been carrying a weight that was finally becoming too heavy to bear. We had clients in today, he said quietly. Important ones. A potential contract worth more than my entire previous salary. I waited, sensing that interruption would derail whatever he was trying to tell me. Kai called me into the conference room while they were there, told me to clean up a spill near the coffee station. Marlow's voice was flat, emotionless. There was no spill, Grant. He handed me paper towels and pointed at a perfectly clean table, and He stopped, swallowing hard. I cleaned it anyway, in front of 3 executives who were trying to figure out what they were watching. What did the clients say? Nothing. They just looked uncomfortable. One of them asked if I was okay, if I needed help. Marlow laughed bitterly. Kai jumped in and explained that I was learning the business from the ground up, that hands-on training was part of our company culture. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was sabotage, designed to strip away not just Marlow's dignity, but his basic sense of reality. Kai was forcing him to participate in his own degradation while presenting it as professional development. How did the meeting end? They left early, said they needed to discuss the proposal internally, but I could tell they were just trying to get out of there. Marlow finally looked at me directly. I think I cost the company a major contract, and Kai will probably blame me for not handling the situation better. You didn't cost them anything, I said firmly. Kai created that situation. He chose to humiliate you in front of clients, and he'll face the consequences of that choice. Marlow shook his head. You don't understand. This is how he operates. Everything that goes wrong becomes a teaching moment about my inadequacies, my failure to adapt to the company culture, my inability to understand the bigger picture. And Marissa? What does she say about all this? His face darkened. She says I'm being too sensitive, that her father is trying to help me develop resilience and humility, that successful people learn to handle criticism and challenging situations without taking everything personally. I recognize the language, the same psychological manipulation that had been used on Marlow for weeks, now being reinforced by the person who should have been his strongest advocate. Marissa wasn't just enabling her father's behavior, she was actively participating in it, helping to gaslight Marlow into believing that his reasonable responses to unreasonable treatment were character flaws. What do you want to do about it? Marlow was quiet for a long time, staring at his beer and working through thoughts he'd probably been avoiding for weeks. I want it to stop, he said finally, but I don't know how to make it stop without losing everything. The job, the marriage, the security I thought I was building. What if you didn't have to lose everything? What if there was a way to address this situation that didn't require you to make ultimatums or burn bridges? He looked at me skeptically. Like what? Like letting the situation resolve itself through proper channels. Companies like Kai's depend on reputation and client relationships. If those relationships are being damaged by inappropriate workplace behavior, that's a business problem that goes beyond personal dynamics. You're talking about reporting him, filing complaints? I'm talking about ensuring that the right people have access to accurate information about how the company operates. What they do with that information is their decision. Marlow considered this, and I could see him wrestling with competing loyalties and fears. The man who'd been systematically broken down over the past month was fighting against the part of him that still believed he could endure anything if it meant achieving his goals. "I can't be the one to do it," he said finally. "Even if you're right, even if it would work, I can't be the one to report Marissa's father. It would destroy my marriage." "You don't have to be the one to do it," I replied calmly. "But you also don't have to keep participating in your own destruction." That weekend, I made another call to Graham Holloway. Our conversation was longer this time, more detailed, focused on specific compliance issues and governance standards that might apply to a company like Ventor Industrial Solutions. "What's prompting this inquiry?" Graham asked, his tone professional but curious. "I've observed some workplace practices that seem inconsistent with standard professional norms," I replied carefully. "I'd like to understand whether these practices might create liability issues for the company and its clients." "What kind of practices?" I described what I'd witnessed and heard, framing everything in terms of business risk and professional standards rather than personal grievances. Graham listened without comment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that suggested he was taking notes. "This sounds like it could create significant compliance issues," he said when I finished, "particularly if clients are witnessing inappropriate workplace dynamics. Most companies have policies specifically designed to prevent these kinds of situations." "What would be the appropriate way to address concerns like this?" "Ideally, through internal channels first. But if those channels aren't available or effective, there are external resources, professional standards organizations, industry associations, regulatory bodies that oversee workplace compliance." "And if someone wanted to ensure that these issues were properly documented and addressed?" Graham was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications of my question. "There are ways to ensure that appropriate authorities are made aware of potential compliance issues," he said finally. "Ways that protect both the reporting party and the integrity of the process. I'd like to discuss those ways in more detail." "I think that would be wise," Graham agreed. "When would be a good time to meet?" As I hung up the phone, I felt the familiar calm that comes with having a clear plan of action. Kai Ventor had spent weeks teaching Marlow that he was powerless, that his only choice was to accept whatever treatment was offered or lose everything he'd worked for. Soon, Kai would learn that power built on humiliation and control is far more fragile than it appears, and unlike his approach to problem solving, mine would be completely legal, thoroughly documented, and absolutely devastating. The line had been crossed. Now it was time to draw some new ones. Graham Holloway's office occupied the top floor of a modest professional building downtown, with windows that offered a clear view of the business district, where companies like Ventor Industrial Solutions projected their success. His conference room was precisely what you'd expect from a compliance consultant. Clean, organized, with filing cabinets that suggested meticulous attention to documentation and process. "I've done some preliminary research based on our phone conversation," Graham said, as we settled into chairs around a polished table. "Ventor Industrial Solutions presents some interesting compliance questions." He opened a folder that contained what appeared to be several pages of notes and printed materials. His approach was methodical, professional, completely divorced from the personal emotions that had brought me to his office. "Let's start with their public representations," he continued, sliding a set of documents across the table. "Their website, marketing materials, and industry association profiles all emphasize their commitment to professional development, employee dignity, and inclusive workplace practices." I scanned the materials, noting language about fostering growth through mentorship, maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct, and creating opportunities for every team member to reach their full potential. "Interesting messaging," I observed. "Very interesting, especially when compared to the workplace practices you described. There's a significant gap between their stated values and their operational reality." Graham pulled out another set of documents, what appeared to be industry standards and regulatory guidelines related to workplace conduct and professional development. Most companies in their sector follow established protocols for employee orientation and training. These protocols exist not just for employee welfare, but to protect the company from liability and maintain professional relationships with clients and partners. What kind of liability? Several types: hostile work environment claims, discrimination issues, breach of professional standards that could affect client relationships. He paused, consulting his notes. Companies that deviate significantly from industry norms often find themselves facing questions from clients, partners, and regulatory bodies. Questions about what? About their internal practices, their commitment to professional standards, their ability to maintain the kind of workplace environment that reflects well on business partners. Graham's tone remained neutral, but I could see where he was leading. Clients don't want to be associated with companies that have questionable internal practices. How would clients typically become aware of internal practices? Various ways: direct observation, employee reports, industry networking, compliance audits. He looked at me directly. Sometimes through formal reviews conducted by independent consultants. I felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. Independent reviews? It's becoming increasingly common for companies to undergo voluntary compliance reviews, especially when they're pursuing major contracts or partnerships. It demonstrates their commitment to professional standards and gives clients confidence in their business practices. And if a company were to undergo such a review? Graham opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be sample audit forms and assessment criteria. The review would examine various aspects of their operation: workplace policies, employee treatment, professional development practices, client interaction protocols. He paused meaningfully. Any significant deviations from industry standards would be documented and reported. Reported to whom? To the company first, obviously, but also to any relevant stakeholders, clients, partners, industry associations, regulatory bodies if appropriate. I studied the sample forms, noting sections for documenting specific incidents, witness statements, and photographic evidence. The process was thorough, professional, and completely legitimate. What would trigger such a review? Various things: a client request, a partner requirement, an industry association recommendation. Graham met my eyes. Or a formal request from a concerned stakeholder who has observed potential compliance issues. A stakeholder like? Anyone with a legitimate interest in the company's professional standards, a business partner, a potential client, a professional colleague who has observed concerning practices. I set down the documents and looked at Graham directly. If someone were to request such a review, how would the process work? First, we'd need to establish the requesting party's standing, their legitimate interest in the company's compliance standards. Then we'd conduct a preliminary assessment to determine whether a full review is warranted. What would constitute legitimate interest? Graham consulted his notes again. Professional relationship with the company, potential business partnership, concern about industry standards, documented observation of questionable practices. And the preliminary assessment? We'd review available information, conduct discrete inquiries within the industry, possibly observe the company's operations if access can be arranged appropriately. I thought about the networking events I'd attended over the years, the professional connections I'd maintained, the consulting work that had brought me into contact with various companies in the industrial sector. How difficult would it be to arrange appropriate access? Not difficult at all, if the requesting party has legitimate business reasons for visiting the facility, a potential consulting engagement, for example, or a partnership discussion. Graham pulled out one more document, what appeared to be a formal compliance review proposal template. This is what a typical engagement would look like, he explained. Initial assessment, on-site observation, stakeholder interviews, documentation review, final report with findings and recommendations. Timeline? Depends on the scope, but typically 2 to 3 weeks for a company of Ventor Industrial's size. The report would be completed within a week of finishing the on-site work. And distribution of the report? To the requesting party, the company being reviewed, and any stakeholders identified as having legitimate interest in the findings. I studied the proposal template, noting sections for client notification, industry association reporting, and regulatory compliance documentation. This is all completely legal and above board? Absolutely. Compliance reviews are a standard business practice. Many companies undergo them voluntarily as part of their quality assurance programs. Graham closed the folders and looked at me with the kind of professional directness that suggested he understood exactly what we were discussing without needing to make it explicit. Would you like me to prepare a formal proposal for a compliance review of Ventor Industrial Solutions? I think that would be appropriate, I replied calmly. Given the potential business relationship I'm considering, I'd want to ensure they meet standard professional practices. Of course. I'll need some basic information about your professional standing and the nature of your potential business relationship. I provided the necessary details: my consulting background, my connections in the industrial sector, my legitimate business reasons for wanting to understand Ventor Industrial's operational practices. Everything was true, verifiable, and completely above board. I'll have a proposal ready by the end of the week, Graham said as we shook hands. Once you approve it, we can begin the preliminary assessment immediately. As I left his office, I felt the satisfaction that comes with having the right tools for the job. Kai Ventor had built his little empire on the assumption that his internal practices would never face external scrutiny. He'd created a closed system where his authority was absolute and his methods were unquestioned. Soon, he would discover that no system is truly closed, and no authority is beyond accountability. The review would be professional, thorough, and completely devastating to his carefully constructed image. All I had to do was make one more phone call. The networking mixer at the downtown Marriott was exactly the kind of event I'd attended dozens of times over the years: industry professionals making connections, discussing potential partnerships, and maintaining the relationships that keep business flowing. What made this particular evening different was the presence of several key clients and partners of Ventor Industrial Solutions. I'd done my research carefully. Graham's preliminary assessment had identified the major players in Kai's business network, and I'd used my own professional connections to ensure invitations to the right events. Nothing unusual, nothing that would attract attention, just a consultant maintaining his industry relationships and exploring new opportunities. Grant Trasker, I said, extending my hand to Richard Carrick, the procurement director for one of Ventor Industrial's largest clients. I don't think we've met, but I've heard excellent things about your company's supplier standards. Carrick smiled and accepted the handshake. Always good to meet another professional in the space. What kind of consulting do you do? Process improvement, mostly. Helping companies optimize their operations and maintain professional standards. I paused, letting that sink in. I've been looking at some potential partnerships in the industrial solutions sector. Competitive field, Carrick observed. Lots of good companies, but you have to be careful about operational quality and workplace culture. Our company has very strict standards for our business partners. Smart approach. I imagine you do thorough due diligence before entering into major contracts. Absolutely. We've learned the hard way that a company's internal culture eventually affects their client relationships. If they don't treat their own people professionally, it's only a matter of time before that impacts their service quality. I nodded thoughtfully. Have you ever encountered situations where a potential partner's workplace practices raised concerns? Carrick's expression grew more serious. Unfortunately, yes. We've had to terminate relationships with companies that couldn't maintain appropriate professional standards. It's always unfortunate, but our reputation depends on the quality of our business relationships. What kind of standards do you typically look for? The basics, really. Professional treatment of employees, appropriate workplace behavior, management practices that reflect well on business partners. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. We actually require compliance reviews for any partnership above a certain threshold. Compliance reviews? Independent assessments of workplace practices, professional standards, operational quality. It helps us avoid situations where a partner's internal problems become our problems. I expressed interest in learning more about their review process, and Carrick was happy to explain their standards and requirements. By the end of our conversation, I had a clear understanding of exactly what would concern a client like his company about a business partner's practices. Similar conversations occurred throughout the evening. I spoke with representatives from 3 other major clients, 2 potential partners, and several industry colleagues who had various levels of professional relationship with Ventor Industrial Solutions. None of these conversations were confrontational or inappropriate. They were simply professional discussions about industry standards and business practices. What emerged was a clear picture of the expectations and standards that governed business relationships in this sector. Companies were increasingly careful about their partnerships, increasingly aware that their own reputations could be damaged by association with partners who didn't maintain appropriate professional practices. Several people mentioned recent situations where business relationships had been terminated due to workplace culture concerns. Others discussed the growing trend toward compliance reviews and professional standards auditing. Everyone seemed to understand that in today's business environment, internal practices were no longer purely internal matters. "You know," said Janet Fallon, a senior partner at a major industrial consulting firm, "we've been seeing more and more situations where companies have to address workplace culture issues because their clients demand it. The days when you could treat employees poorly and still maintain professional relationships are pretty much over." What happens when clients discover inappropriate workplace practices? Depends on the severity, but usually it starts with questions, then formal reviews, then contract modifications or terminations if the issues aren't addressed immediately. Janet sipped her wine thoughtfully. "We had a client last year who lost 3 major contracts within a month after their workplace practices became public knowledge." How did the practices become public? Compliance review. One of their potential partners requested an independent assessment, and the findings were problematic. Word gets around quickly in our industry. As the evening wound down, I had achieved exactly what I'd hoped to accomplish. I'd established my legitimate professional interest in the sector, documented the standards and expectations that governed business relationships, and confirmed that compliance reviews were not only appropriate, but increasingly common. More importantly, I'd planted seeds. Several people had asked about my potential partnerships in the industrial solutions sector, and I'd mentioned that I was conducting due diligence on several companies, including some that might require formal compliance assessments. The next morning, I called Graham Holloway. "I've completed my industry research," I told him. "I'm ready to proceed with the formal compliance review." "Excellent. I've prepared the preliminary assessment and identified several areas of concern that warrant further investigation. When would you like to schedule the on-site portion of the review?" "As soon as possible. I have reason to believe that the workplace practices we discussed are ongoing and may be affecting client relationships. I can begin the on-site assessment next week. I'll need to arrange appropriate access to the facility. I can help with that. I have legitimate business reasons for visiting, and I can request a facility tour as part of my due diligence process." "Perfect. I'll prepare the formal documentation and begin scheduling interviews with relevant stakeholders." "What about notification requirements?" "The company will be informed that a compliance review is being conducted, but not necessarily about the specific concerns that prompted it. The review will be presented as standard due diligence for a potential business relationship." As I hung up the phone, I felt the calm satisfaction that comes with having all the pieces in place. Kai Ventor had spent months teaching Marlow that he was powerless, that his only choices were submission or loss. He'd created a closed system where his authority was absolute and his methods were unquestioned. In less than 2 weeks, that system would be subjected to external scrutiny by professionals who understood the difference between leadership and abuse, between professional development and systematic humiliation. The findings would be documented, reported, and distributed to every stakeholder who had a legitimate interest in Ventor Industrial Solutions business practices. Kai's empire was built on the assumption that no one was watching, that no one cared enough to hold him accountable, that his internal practices would never face external consequences. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The conference room at Ventor Industrial Solutions had been arranged to project success and competence. Kai sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by Marissa and Ronald Pierce, the operations manager who'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with the company's practices over the past several months. Around the table sat representatives from 3 major clients, 2 potential partners, and Graham Holloway, whose presence had been explained as part of a routine compliance review for potential business expansion. Marlow sat near the back of the room, officially present to take notes, but effectively invisible in the way that had become his standard position in company meetings. I occupied a chair along the wall, my presence explained as a potential consulting partner conducting due diligence. Kai opened the meeting with his usual confidence, welcoming everyone and expressing his appreciation for their continued partnership and interest in Ventor Industrial Solutions. "We've always prided ourselves on maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation. "Our commitment to excellence extends from our client relationships to our internal operations." Graham nodded politely and opened his folder. "That's exactly what we're here to assess. As part of the compliance review process, I've conducted a thorough evaluation of your workplace practices, professional development programs, and operational standards." "Of course," Kai replied, his smile confident. "We welcome any opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to professional excellence." "Excellent. Let me begin with some observations about your employee orientation and training procedures." Graham's tone remained completely professional as he began to present his findings, but I could see Kai's expression begin to change as the true nature of the review became clear. "I observed several instances of what appear to be non-standard training practices," Graham continued, consulting his notes. "Specifically, the assignment of janitorial duties to employees hired for professional positions, the public humiliation of staff members during client visits, and the systematic use of degrading tasks as purported professional development." The room grew very quiet. Richard Carrick, the procurement director I'd spoken with at the networking event, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Could you elaborate on these observations?" Carrick asked. "Certainly. I documented multiple instances where an employee hired for project management was required to perform custodial work, serve refreshments during meetings, and complete personal errands for management. These tasks were presented as professional development, but they appear to violate standard workplace conduct guidelines." Kai's face was beginning to flush, but he maintained his composure. "Our training program is comprehensive and designed to ensure that every employee understands all aspects of our operation." "I understand that rationale," Graham replied calmly, "but the practices I observed go well beyond comprehensive training. They constitute what most professional standards would classify as workplace harassment and potential hostile work environment violations." Janet Fallon, the consulting firm partner I'd met at the networking mixer, spoke up. "Are you saying that employees are being systematically degraded under the guise of training?" "That would be an accurate characterization of what I observed," Graham confirmed. Ronald Pierce, who had been growing more uncomfortable throughout the presentation, cleared his throat. "I should mention that I've had concerns about some of our internal practices for several months. I've tried to address these through internal channels, but—" He trailed off, glancing nervously at Kai, whose expression had shifted from confident to dangerous. "Ronald," Kai said, his voice carrying a warning. I think there may be some misunderstanding about our training methodologies. No misunderstanding, Graham interjected smoothly. I have detailed documentation including photographic evidence and witness statements. The practices are clearly documented and well beyond the scope of any reasonable training program. Carrick exchanged glances with the other client representatives. This is very concerning. Our company has strict standards for our business partners, and what you're describing would violate several of our partnership requirements. I understand your concern, Graham replied. That's why this review was requested. Potential business partners need to understand the full scope of a company's operational practices. Kai finally lost his composure. This is ridiculous. We're being judged by some outside consultant who doesn't understand our business culture or our methods. Marlow, tell them how valuable your training has been. Every eye in the room turned to Marlow, who had been silent throughout the presentation. For a moment, he looked exactly like the broken man who'd been cleaning toilets on his first day, accepting humiliation as education. Then something changed in his expression. No, Marlow said quietly. Excuse me? Kai's voice was sharp with disbelief. Marlow stood up slowly, his voice growing stronger. No, I won't tell them that. I won't pretend that being humiliated and degraded was valuable training. I won't lie to protect a system that was designed to break me down. The room was completely silent. I was hired as a project manager, Marlow continued, his voice steady and clear. Instead, I was assigned to clean toilets, serve coffee, and run personal errands, while being told I should be grateful for the opportunity to learn humility. That's not training, that's abuse. Marissa started to speak, but Marlow held up his hand. I'm not finished, he said firmly. I accepted this treatment because I was told it was temporary, that it was necessary, that it would lead to real opportunities. But it was never about my development. It was about establishing dominance and control. He looked directly at Kai. You created a system where my only choices were submission or loss. But you made a mistake. You assumed that no one outside this room would ever see what you were doing, that your methods would never face external scrutiny. Marlow reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is my resignation letter, effective immediately. The silence that followed was broken by Carrick's voice. I think we've heard enough, he said, closing his folder. Our company will be terminating our contract with Ventor Industrial Solutions pending a full internal review of this situation. The client representatives nodded and, one by one, suspended their business relationships pending internal reviews. Kai tried to explain and minimize the revelations, but the damage was irreversible. Graham closed the meeting, confirming his final report would be distributed within 48 hours with full findings and recommendations. I watched Kai's empire collapse in real time. The partners and clients who sustained his power walked away, exposing his authority as an illusion that couldn't survive scrutiny. Marissa sat in stunned silence, finally realizing that defending her father's methods had destroyed not just Marlow, but the company itself. Marlow left the room with his dignity restored and his future in his own hands. The man once reduced to a servant had reclaimed his voice. Outside, Marlow asked how long I'd been planning this. Since the day I found you cleaning toilets, I said. Some lines can't be uncrossed. All of it? He asked. All of it. Kai believed no one was watching. He was wrong. When Marlow asked what came next, I told him this was the moment to discover who he was without accepting abuse. 6 months later, Marlow was thriving with his own consulting firm. Kai's company had collapsed under lost clients and reputational damage. Marissa filed for divorce, understanding that some loyalties cost too much. The quiet call I'd made that first day achieved exactly what I intended. Justice doesn't need drama, only patience, preparation, and accountability. Power doesn't come from humiliation. It comes from restoring dignity, legally and without warning. The empty chairs in Kai Ventor's conference room said everything. The truth, revealed to the right audience, was enough.